Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Nevena, and I'm the General Manager of the Information Rights Project. And along with the Whistleblower Justice Fund, we're pleased to bring you this very special briefing event. Today is the second anniversary of David McBride's sentencing. On the 14th of May, 2024, he was sentenced to 5 years and 8 months in prison for whistleblowing to the ABC. The information he provided formed the basis of Afghan Files reporting, which revealed credible evidence of war crimes committed by Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan. The Brereton inquiry, the Commonwealth's own investigation, subsequently confirmed those findings. However, 2 years on, David McBride remains the only person imprisoned in connection with Australian Afghan war crimes. On the 7th of April this year, Ben Robert Smith was arrested and charged with 5 counts of the war crime of murder. He was released on bail 10 days later to be appearing at court at a later time this year. Yet the man who helped bring the underlying conduct to light is still behind bars. Let's remember that David gave up his career, his freedom, his health, family, and friends to make sure the Australian public knew what was being done in our name. He served 2 deployments in Afghanistan. He raised his concerns through every internal channel available to him. And when that failed, he went to the press. He did what we would want someone to do, and he has paid the price for it with years of his life. So tonight, we're here to do 3 things: to tell the story to people encountering it for the first time, to galvanise the many of you who have been along for this journey, and to consider the enormous sacrifice David has made for himself and for Australia. To delve deeper into what this sentencing means, we're joined by 4 wonderful guests. Gabriel Shipton is the founder and chair of the Information Rights Project. Before founding the organisation, Gabriel spent years leading the international campaign to free his brother, Julian Assange. Rex Patrick, former senator and the founder of the Whistleblower Justice Fund. Rex has been one of the most persistent voices in this country on government transparency and accountability. Eddie Lloyd, David McBride's defence lawyer. Eddie has represented David through trial, sentencing, and appeal, and brings with us, I believe, a message from David tonight, which we'll be hearing later. And Sally Neighbour, one of Australia's most respected investigative journalists and the former executive producer of Four Corners at the ABC. Welcome, panellists, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Eddie, I might start with you first. It has been 2 years to the day since David was sentenced. For people joining tonight who may be hearing this story for the first time, what is the single most important thing the public needs to understand about his case?
Yeah, I was just thinking today, that's right, budget day. That's when they did it all. When the media were all so busy there, they wouldn't be at the court case. Look, I think the message that we all need to take from the case of David McBride is to be very aware that this could happen to any of us. Really, at the end of the day, what David was doing was his job. He was doing his job and he was doing it extremely well. And I think it just really hopefully sends a message to the community to have a little bit of a closer look at what our government are doing, and to take some, to look at David McBride in a way where he is not regretting anything that he has done. And I think that we all need to learn how to grow our moral courage a bit and be ready to stand up when we see wrongdoing in our workplace or anywhere, in fact, and not be afraid of what the government has in store in terms of fighting us when we want to speak the truth, because we just need more and more people like David McBride. So I hope people look at him like a hero that he is, and that it inspires all of us to do more and tell the truth whenever we can.
Sally, you've seen this story from many different angles. From your perspective, to someone who might be coming new to hearing David McBride's story, what do you feel is the most important thing the public needs to understand about this case?
The most important point to me is one that's already been made, but needs to be made over and over again, and that is that the allegations and evidence of war crimes by Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan was one of the biggest stories and one of the biggest scandals in Australia in the past decade. And yet, to this day, the only person jailed and convicted and jailed over those revelations is David McBride, the whistleblower who brought them to light. It's outrageous and its indictment on the treatment of whistleblowers in this country. And our government has repeatedly promised to protect whistleblowers, and it's introduced some reforms, but they're wholly inadequate and they simply haven't lived up to their promises.
Gabriel, you understand the human cost of not only seeing someone you know and love going through this, but also going through the process of persecution. What do you think is the single most important thing the public needs to understand about David's case?
Well, I'll echo Eddie and Sally and say, David's unbelievable courage, in the face of these enormous institutions bearing down on him. He stood for what he believed in, and still brought that information to the public. So that, I think, from my perspective and from my experience, it's that courage that is very, very rare, and we don't find that often. And someone like David, who's displayed that sort of courage, is an absolute hero. I think it's worth talking about back in 2017, when all this kicked off. The ABC offices were actually raided, and so this wasn't just going after the whistleblower. The AFP actually raided the ABC offices. You went through ABC computers, and they have extraordinary powers. They had extraordinary powers to even change information that they found on the devices of journalists, computers, and inside the ABC. And so that point, I think, after all these years, we still forget that there was absolute intimidation at that time in 2017. And afterwards, what we saw was the full force of these institutions come after David. The government, the military, they went after David with everything they could. And I think that is really telling for everybody here of the substance of what David brought to light. If it had no consequence, it had no meaning, then there wouldn't have been such a strong reaction.
Rex, the Whistleblower Justice Fund was set up to fight for and advocate people like David. From your perspective, what's that important thing that stands out about this case for you that you'd like the public to know?
Well, it's simply the case of the odds against the official that tries to do things correctly, and we've seen this in actually multiple cases. So it's in some sense a repeat of the things that we are seeing in the case of Richard Boyle. There's another couple of whistleblowers that are going through court now where they seem to have been stripped of protections. We need to protect our whistleblowers, and as has been repeated by those three before me, this is a tragedy in circumstances where some elements of our Defence Force committed abhorrent killings of people that were in their charge. David McBride brought a range of conduct to the attention of his superiors through the system. That didn't work for him. He then went to the media, and now he finds himself in jail. And again, he is the only person who has been jailed in respect of those war crimes. He didn't commit them. He simply alerted people to them, and that is a tragedy.
Rex, staying there, Australia's whistleblower protection laws obviously did not protect David. They did not protect Richard Boyle. The promised reforms are, let's say, incomplete. Is there a reason to believe the government will act? And if not, what does that mean for the next person who considers speaking up?
Well, I've just been looking at the Labor Party national platform that's going to be debated at their national conference, and they say that Labor believes public sector whistleblowing whistleblowers should be protected, not punished. I almost can't believe the statement's in there based on the conduct of the government. But if I were to believe that, maybe we can all go home. But the reality is that. And I have some experience with this. I was the person who negotiated some of the whistleblower protections as an advisor to Nick Xenophon. I also negotiated some of the protections in respect of the corporate whistleblower legislation that we have. And it was hard. It was hard because you're dealing with parties of government who aren't particularly interested in people being able to disclose wrongdoing behind the dark curtains of government. We have an opportunity to have good people working inside the public service, acting as, in effect, silent police officers to call out misconduct. But in actual fact, what we'd really prefer is whistleblower laws that were so strong that no one dares do anything because they know they will be reported and they know that the person doing the reporting will be protected. We don't have the right laws in our country. There's been a slow chipping away at things, but in almost all circumstances, when you're dealing with a whistleblower, you've got a very large government entity, a government company, or a very large, well-resourced business person, and they have to go up against the whistleblower has to go up against those large, well-funded entities. And it leaves us in a situation where there's no benefit for, even if people don't end up in jail, as sadly David has, they blow the whistle, often find nothing much gets done, and then have to go through the courts because suddenly they don't have a job anymore. They're fighting up against really big and well-resourced entities, and they have no money. They've been and they've been demoralised by the fact that they've been taken out of their work environment. It's hard to understand why the major parties haven't really tried to enforce and bring in and enforce strong whistleblower protections. And that's why we need everyone's help to continue putting pressure on government.
Sally, the Brereton inquiry found credible evidence of 23 incidents of unlawful killing. Charges have now been laid against 2 soldiers. In your view, without David McBride's disclosures, would we still be here today?
I think we'd be in a very different position without David's disclosures. I mean, David didn't trigger the Brereton inquiry. That was commissioned the year before the Afghan Files were published. But David was the first insider to go public about Australia's conduct in Afghanistan and about the evidence of war crimes and atrocities in Afghanistan by Australian Special Forces. Prior to that, the Brereton inquiry was conducting its inquiries under a veil of complete secrecy, which is how governments in Australia always deal with issues like this. So David was the first person to bring this issue into the public domain. And had he not done that, I think it's quite likely that we would not have had the same level of public debate and scrutiny on this issue that we've had. And it would have been much easier for the government and the authorities to keep the whole issue under wraps, which no doubt they would have preferred to do. So David really did us all an enormous service, and he should have been given a medal rather than 5 years in prison.
Gabriel, Australia consistently tells the world that it supports a rules-based international order and human rights abroad. How do you think we square that with imprisoning the person who exposed alleged war crimes by our own forces?
Well, obviously, it's complete hypocrisy, right? But I think, I sort of grapple with this idea a lot, and I think you can look to the United States and see what's happening under the Trump administration there, and this, there's sort of the hypocrisy has totally disappeared from the the American system. Like, they just sort of act with impunity now, and there's not even a gap between the rhetoric and the action. And I think, to me, when there is a little bit of a gap between the rhetoric and the action, I think that means, as Australians, we are holding up to a higher ideal. And so having hypocrisy in this situation, I see it as a good thing, because we know that as Australians, and our government we aspire to have a proper democracy, a democracy where people can tell the truth about what our taxes are paying for, or what our human institutions are doing, or the crimes that they try to hide. That we are aspirational, and we aspire to have that sort of democracy. So I don't know if I'm like getting high on my own supply or whatever, but it's sort of encouraging in a sense that there is that we have that gap between what we are aiming for as Australians, and how we're treating these whistleblowers.
Eddie, David has now spent 2 years inside. You speak to him regularly. I believe you have a message from him to share tonight. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Eddie, you're just on mute.
Sorry about that. Yes, I do have a message from Dave, and again, it's one of immense gratitude for everybody else. He's a very selfless man. He is doing okay in custody. He is, it's a horrible place. It's a horrible place, especially coming into winter in that particular jail. He really misses his girls. He misses his life, his community, but what has kept him strong in custody is the non-stop communication from people all around the world, not just Australia. Like, he continually gets postcards and letters. There are some people that write to him every single week since he's been in there. He gets a letter from them. So that really warms his heart. He doesn't have any regrets. He's looking forward to getting released, and we hope that will be on August 13 this year. But it's going to be a very daunting time. He's experiencing a lot of anxiety thinking about what it's going to be like. So, public support, us all just kind of wrapping our arms around him and supporting him will be what is needed to help him heal from this revolting time he's had in custody over the last 2 years.
And Eddie, for people who see David's guilty plea and perhaps don't have a complete understanding of what that might mean, and maybe associate that with assumed guilt, can you explain what David was actually facing in the courtroom?
Yeah, well, I think when we see that someone has pleaded guilty, I'm hoping that people who are realising the dystopia that we are living in and the false democracy that we are living under, where Julian had to plead guilty, Richard Boyle had to plead guilty, David McBride had to plead guilty. So I'm hoping people don't take that guilty plea as he must have done something bad, because the reason he pleaded guilty was he could not face the crushing of the resources of the Commonwealth of Australia that the government ensured were on top of him. He was, in essence, coming to a big gunfight with a butter knife, really, at the end of the day. There was no level playing field for David McBride. And as his lawyer representing him, I knew that, we have some problems in our democracy and, but this case actually frightened me and really disappointed me. And as a lawyer, it just kind of took something away from me to see that a situation where the government, the Attorney General, could swoop into the normal, judicial discretion area of the court and remove evidence and just leave evidence that could be released into the media that stitched up a certain narrative that was adverse to Dave McBride. I think that was one of the things that, he couldn't overcome. It was, the oversight panel report to the Afghanistan inquiry been given to the government just days before his trial started. They sat on that. They didn't want the media to have that because it validated what he was saying. His entire case has been, there's something not right here. The law has been misapplied, and I'm reporting it to all of the leadership, and they're not doing anything about it. And they're telling me to shut up and go away. So I think that oversight panel report, which really criticised the Afghanistan inquiry for not holding the leadership accountable, if that had have been released into the background of everything when his trial was about to start, that would have been very different. So there was a lot of sneaky kind of conduct on behalf of the government in his particular trial. It was definitely a lot of political interference and persecution and, you know, trying to bring down his character constantly. And so, you know, with the evidence that was left, which was barely anything, he didn't really have a defense case to put. So he really had no choice. Like, his hands were tied. There was nothing he could say. Everything, if there was to be a jury impaneled, they were just going to be given white pieces of paper. And I remember I wasn't in the trial, but I think McBride's defence team at the time were pointing out how ridiculous that was and saying, well, why don't we just, you know, give them all of the pages with all of the redactions, the black marks through it, but the Commonwealth didn't want that. They just wanted these clean white pages. So it was never a level playing field for David McBride, and the same as Julian has faced with accusations in the background. And, you know, it is just the persecution of a truth teller once again.
So 3 weeks ago, Eddie, Ben Roberts-Smith was charged with 5 counts of the war crime of murder and released on bail. David McBride, the man who helped bring these crimes to light, is in prison. To you, what does that contrast tell you about the Australian legal system in its current form?
Contrast, but also not contrast, actually. We can see, you know, in the case of, it's been, 17 years since one of the allegations that Ben Roberts-Smith has been charged with. I don't know why it has taken them so long. I think that is there's something going on there that it took so long for Ben Roberts-Smith to be charged. What I think we will see that they will have in common, both of them, is Ben Roberts-Smith no doubt is going to start pointing to other people. And my view is that trial is just never going to happen, that it will just go on for a few years and then the whole thing will fall apart. I think for David McBride, the obvious contrast is that he's the one that's, releasing this evidence to the media that involved BRS and Oliver Schultz, and that he's getting, punished for that. I think I'm hoping actually that if the trial goes ahead, the Ben Roberts-Smith trial goes ahead, that there is then opportunity for people to start asking the questions that David has been trying to get answers for the last 12 years about the leadership and the cover-up and what they knew and why they continued to award Ben Roberts-Smith medal after medal after medal after many people in the leadership knew what he had done.
Thanks, Eddie. Sally, truth-telling and press freedom are intertwined here. We have the Afghan Files, as we've mentioned, were based on the documents that David McBride provided to the ABC. The Australian Federal Police then raided ABC offices back in 2019. From a journalist's and a newsroom perspective, what happens to investigative reporting in this country when the source goes to prison and the newsroom gets raided?
Well, one thing to point out is the very different reactions to those two things. That is, the newsroom getting raided, which happened first, and then the source going to prison. The raid on the ABC and the journalist Annika Smethurst received a huge amount of coverage. The media was up in arms, not surprisingly, about those raids and highly critical. The ABC journalists were lauded for their reporting, deservedly so. Reporter Dan Oakes was even awarded an Order of Australia for services to journalism, this by the very same government that effectively sent his source, David McBride, to jail, or certainly was very happy to see him sent to jail. Astonishing, gobsmacking hypocrisy. So that's one thing that happened. The other thing that happens is that obviously there is a deeply chilling effect on this kind of whistleblowing and reporting. There's no doubt the authorities intended to make an example of David as a warning to other whistleblowers who might consider doing what he did, and to make an example of the journalists, to convey to journalists what they were up against. But, clearly it was the whistleblower David who paid the incredibly high price that he did. And so it would take enormous courage to risk the same punishment for anyone who was considering whistleblowing, to risk the same punishment that David has faced.
Sally, you've spent decades leading some of Australia's most consequential investigative journalism. In your view and in your experience, are sources still coming forward, or is the McBride case doing exactly what it was designed to do?
Look, thankfully, whistleblowers are still coming forward. I spoke today ahead of this webinar to my friend and colleague Adele Ferguson, whose brilliant journalism, as you would all know, is heavily reliant on whistleblowers. And she made the point that whistleblowers have a very strong, uniquely strong moral compass, and they cannot resist the need to go public and reveal wrongdoing of various kinds. And Adele, who was, a leading investigative journalist, says she's still getting people coming to her, and she's in awe of that. But the odds are very heavily stacked against them. The major political parties in this country have been effectively captured by the security and intelligence agencies. The government and the coalition are in lockstep on this. They will not challenge or question those agencies. They back them to the hilt, to a greater extent than I can ever remember having been the case. And so it's left to the independents and the Greens to hold them to account. I'm sorry to say that key parts of the mainstream media have also been captured by the security and intelligence agencies. We see it every day in our newspapers. Certain journalists are on a drip from the AFP and ASIO. They get a steady supply of exclusive stories, and they will not rock that boat. And you will see very few critical stories by the journalists who benefit from that relationship. And as a result, I think the reporting on national security in particular is the most uncritical it's been for as long as I can have ever experienced. One example, I think, is the clear intelligence failings that preceded the Bondi shootings. Those have been essentially ignored, more or less. So I'm hoping the Royal Commission will shed some light on those. One other thing that's worth mentioning is that the mainstream or legacy media is essentially in an existential fight for its own survival. So where you used to see the media companies, I should say, banding together to stand up on important issues like freedom of information, for example, they just don't really do that anymore because they're just really focused on trying to stay afloat.
Sally, that's such an interesting point that you raise about the capture of parts of the media and journalists. Is there a point in time where you saw that shift happening, or where that became incredibly obvious to you?
I think it became pretty obvious after David's case. I think there was a realisation among the authorities that they had bungled their relationship with the media with those raids, and they got really bad publicity around that time as a result. And there appears to me to have been some kind of a strategic shift to try and win over parts of the media, and that seems to have been successful for them.
I just, with our work at Information Rights Project, we were raising funds to help a Four Corners, an ex-ASIO spy who went undercover in some of these radical, I don't know what you'd call them, cells out in Western Sydney. He blew the whistle, speaking to Four Corners about what he saw and how he had warned ASIO about particularly the son, Akram Naveed. We were working on that, and I was actually briefing journalists on this topic, right? Like, because it was covered by Four Corners, but I was briefing journalists, from our network that we developed over the years, and there was definitely some backgrounding happening by the intelligence services against this whistleblower. There were people calling it. A number of journalists that I'd spoke to had already been given the skinny by the intelligence services about this whistleblower, and it was very obvious. And plain to me that there was a concerted effort and operation by ASIO not only to publicly discredit Marcus, but also to go around to all their I guess it's like all their access journalists, right? Like it's access journalism, and brief them. And there is that, it's not necessarily, I don't think it's necessarily, do this story and we won't give you more stories, or we will cut off your source. But there is definitely an implied agreement there that the journalists won't step out of line because that they know that their source for these fresh stories from the intelligence services might get cut off.
And so, Gabriel, what's the cost of democracy if journalists are so inherently entwined with national security, not only for stories, but, part of their livelihoods?
This is one of the problems with access journalism and journalism. But luckily, we have people like Adele Ferguson. We still have some courageous journalists out there who are not coveting these access journalist roles. But I think we just have to be very, as a society, we have to be very aware and go to multiple sources to get our information, comparing sources. And luckily, there is still some competition within Australian media. I mean, less and less. And I think what we've seen with the independent sources, the independent media outlets, their audience growing and growing. And so having that competition of media, I think, particularly with the internet and the spreading of these independent outlets, has been a net benefit for us.
Can I just add something there to that? I think what we've seen a lot over a long period of time now is the failing of really our education systems in teaching people. I'm really, really passionate about even kindergarten children learning about civics, learning about democracy and what that actually means, because I don't think people really can see what is happening around us with the media. There's a lack of critical thinking anymore that I think that we're not teaching children and teaching them democracy and critical thinking. And I think that if we had more education out there for people, that we would spot this immediately, and it wouldn't be having us having to have forums and campaigns to try to paint the picture for everyone, to educate everybody this late in the day, So I think that really needs to start. I'm trying to be positive and thinking how things could be different. And that's what I think, like early education, civics education, critical thinking, so people can learn, what is fake and what is not, what is the truth and what is not, to ask those questions and not just accept what they're being told on TV.
Here. Rex, you set up the Whistleblower Justice Fund after watching what the system did to David and other brave whistleblowers. You were a senator. You have seen this from the inside. Is the failure to protect whistleblowers a gap in the law, or is the law working exactly as intended?
Well, I think a lot of people would think it does work exactly as intended. I mentioned before about the David Goliath situation you find yourself in if you're a whistleblower. You really are out on your own against a very well-resourced player. One of the things I tried to do in the Senate, and I did this following up, and I have to give credit to Nick Xenophon. He helped negotiate a whole bunch of, or at least get agreements for changes to whistleblower laws. One of the things I tried to do, because I took over from him, was to make sure that whenever there was a law and there could be ambiguity in the law, that the ambiguity fell in favour of the whistleblower. I'll give you an example. If you are in a company, you blow the whistle and you are fired under the corporation's whistleblowing legislation, which is something I negotiated, then what happens is all you have to do is prove to the court that you were fired, which is a pretty easy thing to do, and then the burden then switches to the company to show in circumstances where you were fired after you blew the whistle, the company then have to prove that you weren't fired because you're a whistleblower. So we did a lot of things like reversing the onus of proof to put things in favour of the whistleblower. But all of that was really hard. I remember, and maybe I might burn a bridge here, but I remember negotiating with Kelly O'Dwyer on whistleblower legislation. And one of the problems you have with that is you don't really have a lot of leverage on it, because even when you're presented with legislation that's not great, it's better than what the current laws might be. And you've got to work out, how do I force them to go further than they want to go? And I remember actually having I might say a heated discussion with Kelly in her ministerial office, where she wasn't going as far as what I would have liked. And I remember walking out and an hour later going into the chamber and doing a second reading speech on another bill where Matthias Cormann needed my vote. And I said very publicly a message that only he would have understood, and that was, I'm wavering in my support for this bill. I got a call probably within 10 or 15 minutes of that. And then suddenly I went and saw Matthias, and suddenly the whistleblower legislation negotiations were re-enlivened, and I ended up flying down to Melbourne to talk to Kelly, and she was much, much better. And so we'll give her credit for that. But everything seemed to be really hard to get the right protections in place. There just didn't seem to be a lot of interest in doing that. It was always hard. Whenever you look at any whistleblower stuff that's going on in the parliament, it's Andrew Wilkie, it's the Greens, it's Barbara Pocock, it was Rex Patrick. It was always the independents that were trying to push things, but they often didn't have the leverage to push harder. And in some sense, that's the reason for the Whistleblower Justice Fund. Is politics is about pressure, and having support from a whole bunch of people in the community where we can bring the issues to Parliament House. We can pay for a truck to encircle Parliament House with whistleblower messaging, or we can fund a webinar, or we can do get a full page ad in the paper, as we did for people like Richard Boyle. That's part of the reasoning or the rationale for that, is because even on the inside, you didn't have all the right pressure points. And so thank you everyone for turning up tonight, because it really is important that we use the community to put pressure on MPs.
Rex, we've spoken tonight about the motivation of whistleblowers. We've talked about their moral compass, their drive for truth and justice. You've worked with many whistleblowers over the years and represented their interests through your work on accountability and transparency. What do you see as the key drivers for people who take this courageous step and put so much on the line?
It just takes someone of awesome courage and integrity to do these sorts of things. Most people simply will not take the risks, knowing full well, and the government seems to like people knowing full well, that they are not protected. There is no upside for a whistleblower. Okay, no upside at all. The best you can do is come out status quo, feeling as though you have assisted the community more generally. The Human Rights Law Centre is now starting to push the model of a bounty scheme, and where, in circumstances where someone blows the whistle and the government then gets to collect extra tax or has a financial benefit out of it, then the whistleblower might get something out of it. The problem is, it's a thankless activity, and it was mentioned the word hero. That's exactly what the circumstance is. And I might just on character. I mean, I met with David McBride last week in Canberra, and his character shows through. I mean, he's in jail and he ought not to be. And but just let everyone know his spirits were that good. I mean, he has taken it so well. I don't think many people could take it as well as him. I almost left the cafe thinking I want to be where he is, because he just was so. He's just such a unique character, and that's what we find with a lot of whistleblowers. They're strong and they really care, and but they don't deserve to go to jail. They need to be rewarded and given medals for what they do.
Thank you, Rex. Gabriel, the Information Rights Project grew out of the campaign to free your brother Julian Assange. You lived through what happens when a government decides to make an example of someone who tells the truth. What do you see when you look at David's case, and what did the Assange campaign teach you about what it takes to win?
Yeah, I think everybody knows that the changes aren't going to come from the top down, and that it's from the bottom up is where the change will come from. And then particularly with Julian's case, and I believe a lot of, in future cases for whistleblowers, and even in David's case, I know a lot of people were aware of this, is that you can fight it out in the courts, but often it's the court of public opinion that actually changes the outcome for these whistleblowers. And so it's really important that everyone here on this call acts. David's got his parole hearing coming up on August 14th, which I think is extremely important that he gets that parole and gets out of prison. So everyone here, everyone on this call must do something to contribute to that, whether it's make a donation to David or sign a letter or call their MP, something like that, because that's what makes a real difference. And no offense, Eddie, but the lawyers can fight it out in the courts. But as you said before, it's a rigged game. And so what really matters is the activists, the political pressure, and it's not just from the political side. I know, Rex, you just told a wonderful anecdote about changing some whistleblower law, but I think there's a lot that can be done from within Parliament by our representatives that is not just changing laws. And we saw that in Julian's case. There was a resolution put before the Parliament acknowledging that Julian was a journalist and that the case against him should be dropped. That was voted for by 2/3 of the Australian Parliament. And that sends a really strong message to the people who were pursuing Julian. And countless letters from elected representatives sent to the Biden administration or Priti Patel, who was the Home Affairs minister in the UK, or the equivalent at the time. Countless letters from parliamentarians from all sides of politics, really just ramping up the pressure. And I think those things that can come out of Parliament are really, really important, and show the judges involved, show the lawyers or the prosecutors involved that we're not going to take this sort of shit, that we will stand up and we will fight back, and there will be consequences when they do these sorts of actions against these modern day heroes of our society.
Thanks, Gabriel. We've got many questions coming through, so we might jump to some now. We've got this excellent question from Tosca. Rex, I'm going to throw this to you. Would you like to discuss how MP Andrew Wilkie, independent from Tasmania, that is, managed to negotiate the system as a whistleblower?
Yeah, so Andrew Wilkie, he was a whistleblower in relation to intelligence that wasn't coming into our troops in Timor-Leste, and so he actually knows from his own experience what it's like to be a whistleblower, and that's why he's such a great advocate. And we interact all the time because. He can do things under parliamentary privilege. He can move motions. He can draw attention to some of these issues that that otherwise go without notice. Andrew did a lot, for example, as we're trying to get the Attorney General to focus on not prosecuting Richard Boyle, getting motions up, getting debates going. All of that's really, really important. And we know with Andrew, it's absolutely genuine because he's been through it and suffered. He's come out the other side, in a good way. That often doesn't happen. Not for the whistleblower, not for their families, so that's why Andrew's such a powerful advocate inside the Parliament.
Thank you. Sally, we've got quite a few questions and comments about the media and their role and some wonderful feedback and comments about yourself. David has asked, in your view, will some of the things come out in the forthcoming trial of Ben Roberts-Smith, and how should the media approach that reporting?
Sorry, what was the question? Will some of
the things from the Afghan Files come out in the forthcoming trial of Ben Roberts-Smith, and how should the media respond to that reporting?
Well, the media, I mean, I guess we don't know what's going to come out in the court case, and we don't know the relationship between what was in the Afghan Files and the evidence that will be presented in that court case. So we won't really know that until it's heard in court. I mean, the media will be quite constrained in its coverage of this case because, of course, Ben Roberts-Smith has the right to the presumption of innocence, and there's always a real danger that if the media does unfairly report a case like this, that the trial could be aborted. And so there's a huge responsibility on the media to report it fairly and accurately, and only to report the evidence that's heard in the court.
Thanks, Sally. This one for you, Gabriel, from Judith. We, unlike many OECD countries, do not have the protection of an individual bill of human rights, which is obviously concerning for whistleblowers and should be for us all. Should we have a Bill of Rights in Australia?
Yeah, I think we should. I believe we should. I think we have these. We're born with these unalienable rights, and why shouldn't they be included in our constitution or in a bill of rights? I think there is more of a push for that. I've seen around recently, but I definitely think we should, at least for freedom of expression. I mean, that'd be a great start to get one for freedom of expression that protects whistleblowers, protects journalists, protects expression in this country. Obviously, it needs some guardrails, but I think something on freedom of expression would go a long way to protecting whistleblowers.
Eddie, Ruth asks, how can we support David now and when he is released?
There's lots and lots of different ways to support David and others and the cause, I would say. I think, as I said, David's going to need a lot of support. What I talk to him a lot about these days in regards to justice and how I see justice as a lawyer after being through his case is justice is coming from the people, it is going to be coming from the support that he gets when he comes out, the validation. So, I think we all need to reframe our view of justice when we're in situations like this, where, we grow up thinking that there's the court, that's where we turn to when there's been overreach of a law, or you've been prosecuted unlawfully or wrongly. You go to the court for justice. And so I think we just need to reframe our brains around that when there's such a case like David McBride, that justice is going to come from the people. And so David is really going to need, people to continue to support him. He has to start again. There's a fundraiser up there. We're building another website for him at the moment. He loves if people can buy his book, because that tells the whole story there. And I think the other thing is we can all, 580 people here on this webinar right now, we can all rock on down to Rex's place in Adelaide when the Labor conference is on, and the whistleblower motion is being debated. We can do things like that. We can get up off the chair and go to Canberra when David is released. I think, as Gabriel has said, it's all down to people power. The government aren't going to do anything unless they're pressured to do it, especially in a situation like this. It was the millions and millions of people around the world that stood up and went to rallies for Julian Assange that eventually saw a political solution to that situation. We still hope that David would get him a pardon. The Rights Project have got a link on their page where you can sign the open letter asking the Attorney General to pardon him. I'm sure Dave is going to be doing the rounds and doing events when he comes out, so make sure you attend any event that he has got on. And I guess the other thing is to just talk. Don't underestimate the power of the word and the ripple effect of your words. And, I've done a lot of webinars for all kinds of things, and sometimes only a couple of people turn up. You just never know where that message is going to end up. So never stop, always politics at the dinner table. Always politics at the dinner table. I think that's the exact place where we should be talking about cases like David McBride. So really talking about it, keeping yourself aware of what's going on in his campaign, because he's not going to stop. I'm going to continue to support him in his march for justice, and we will get it. And we're not going to get it from the courts, but we will get it by informing other people and getting more people to be aware of his case so it doesn't happen to anyone again.
Eddie, I just want to ask a question in terms of, I should know this, but I don't. The normal process is that the Attorney General signs off on parole for Commonwealth, people convicted of a Commonwealth crime, but we do have a new parole board that's coming in. Is he going to be subject to the parole board or to the Attorney General?
Rex, I don't think that parole board's going to be done in time. He's already starting to apply for parole. I think there would be a lot of backlash if Michelle Rowland the Attorney General did not grant him parole. He's been a model prisoner. He actually pleaded guilty. I'd be very surprised if he...
And that's where I wanted to go, is that... David's parole is not guaranteed. One might hope that that occurs. So people who are on the webinar, one of the things you can do is write to the Attorney General and say that David must be released. And when you finish that letter, then write to your local MP and make sure your local MP knows that that's an important issue for you, and ask them to raise it with the Attorney General or to raise it in Parliament. And when you're thinking about your one local member, also think about the 12 senators that represent your state and also write to them. It is that people power. That's something you all can do individually. The Whistleblower Justice Fund will be looking at what we can do. I've said it a couple of times tonight. Politics is about pressure. It is the Attorney General that will grant parole to David, it would appear. So we need to put pressure on.
I probably shouldn't be so blasé about assuming he's going to get parole, because I remember watching Senate estimates a year or two ago, and the question was asked because the Attorney General only has about, in this period of time that was being examined, I think it was like 40 people in that past year or 2 years that had come up for parole that the Attorney General needed to decide on. So it's not many people in Australia that the Attorney General, and out of that 40, I think one of them had got parole. So, I mean, whilst I think everything's going to be okay for David McBride, it might not be. Looking at that kind of statistic, it very well might not be. So, let's hope that, we can, put enough pressure on our parliamentarians if that happens to.
Everyone needs to put pen to paper
Yeah.
and write to the Attorney General and to their local MP and to their senators. And the Whistleblower Justice Fund will be looking at ways in which we can put pressure on the government to make sure that that we get the right answer when his parole comes up.
Thank you. We've got a question from George. This one's for Sally. What pressure may journalists experience that prevents them from writing to fairly present both sides of a story, for example, in relation to Marcus, the ASIO whistleblower?
Well, I mean, those who paid attention to that story will see what an aggressive approach ASIO took to the ABC when it was in the process of making that story and reporting that story. ASIO was extremely unhelpful and extremely aggressive, and wrote to the ABC and with kind of implied threats of, they used the phrase, we will exercise all our legal rights, which it's outrageous for a publicly funded national security body to be making threats like that to journalists when they're reporting a story that's clearly in the public interest, because the story was about whether there was or should have been intelligence available to give the authorities some warning of the Bondi shootings. And so the fact that, the National Security Agency would throw its weight around in that way is really inappropriate. I have experience of the same thing happening in relation to other stories, and I can't even talk about it because, we heard from Rex earlier that today legislation passed the Senate to extend what was supposed to be temporary compulsory questioning powers that were introduced for ASIO after September 11 and were supposed to expire at some point, and they have now been extended so they've become permanent. And those powers include things like, for example, people who are questioned by ASIO can go to jail if they reveal that. And, it's been made clear in the past to journalists like myself that any dealings that we have with ASIO have to be completely secret. So it's, the fact that we can't even talk about it is, not helpful and not a sign of a healthy functioning democracy.
Gabriel, David asked, whatever happened to the public interest? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, yeah, look, I still think there are some, there's still some very good reporters out there and very good journalists doing great work. And I think that there's sort of this access journalism that we're talking about is a problem, but we still have people like Sean Rubenstein who are doing these Four Corners reports, who are speaking to these whistleblowers. So there are still some great journalists out there doing really, really great work in the public interest. So yeah, I still think I'm probably a little bit too much of an optimist. But yeah, I'm really encouraged by some of these journalists, independent media as well. Michael West Media, Pearls and Irritations, like they're putting out some very, very courageous work, and I I recommend anybody go and log on to those sites. And we are having wins, right? Like we're having serious wins. I don't know if anybody's been following the Anti-Semitism Commission, but it appears that we're having some wins there. And also Francesca Albanese, who was the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied territories, today had the US sanctions against her have been dropped today. So we still can win and we can still make progress. Julian's case is one of those. So don't be disheartened. And as Rex said, write those letters. I think we'll get an email out to everybody who was on the call on this webinar today with the pro forma letter, so that if you're wondering what to write, we'll help you and who to write to. So that's a very important step to keep that pressure up for David's parole, that is.
Thank you, Gabriel. It's 7 p.m. I firstly want to thank the hundreds of people who have joined us on this call. I think we've done the three things we set out to do today and really brought to light the courage that David and the sacrifice David has made for all of Australians tonight. Rex, thank you for shining a light in some very seedy and dark places in Canberra. Gabriel, thank you for sharing the human side of the story. Sally, thank you so much for sharing how these stories come to light and how Australians can stay informed. And Eddie, for your endless advocacy and support of David. It's been an incredible event and it shows you that this is another step in the fight. So many comments coming in now. Thank you, Chris, is saying excellent webinar, great webinar. This will be circulated and actions to take with the Attorney General will be shared. Thank you for your courage, everyone, and thank you for your solidarity. Good night and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you.